government spending, Afghanistan, and vaccine misinformation. I'm Heather Godwin, and this is The Square Circle. Hello, and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Heather Godwin. Joining us today are conservative columnist for the Washington Examiner, Quin Hillyer. Welcome, Quin.
Thank you. Glad to be on, Heather.
Nice to have you back. Libertarian and host of Right Now, Stephen Kent. Hello, Stephen.
Hey, pleasure.
And progressive Erin Matson, executive director of Repro Action.
Hello.
Welcome, Erin. This week, Democrats in Congress seem to have struck a deal to avert a government shutdown, but several other spending measures are still up in the air. Here's CNBC with the story.
Now, Congress is planning to vote on a bill today that would keep the lights on through December the 3rd. The Senate will go first, then the House, and both parties are confident that they can send it to the president's desk before the deadline at midnight. Now, the debt ceiling, however, that is still up in the air. The House passed a bill that would have suspended the debt limit through December 16th, 2022, though it is going nowhere in the Senate amid united Republican opposition. Also happening in the House today, as you mentioned, that vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Theoretically, Democratic leadership is essentially daring progressives to follow through on their promise to block it unless the social spending package has passed as well. But the head of the Progressive Caucus, Representative Pramila Jayapal, was clear. She tweeted, "Progressives remain ready and willing to vote for the infrastructure bill after the popular Build Back Better Act is passed. We can't leave childcare, paid leave, healthcare, housing, education, and climate action behind."
Erin Matson, executive director of Repro Action. What's your take on this?
Well, I'm delighted that the government is not going to shut down. And I think collectively, people are sighing a breath of relief in Washington and around the country that we're not doing that. There's still a lot of concern about the debt ceiling that needs to be raised. That's an urgent issue that remains. And as far as government spending moving forward, I'll say that Nancy Pelosi has tremendous control and is an extremely effective speaker. And while I expect we'll see more chaos in the headlines, I ultimately expect that we will get bills passed.
Stephen, what are your thoughts?
I guess I take issue with the idea that Nancy Pelosi is a particularly effective speaker when she can't even figure out what her only two dissenting members, that's on the Senate side, but being able to wrangle the Democratic Party behind the entirety of this funding package, like between the leadership on the Democratic side, it just seems like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi just can't figure out what two people want to actually pass both government funding and the infrastructure bill. We're talking about Manchin and Sinema here in this case. I don't know. The situation is just kind of embarrassing, like these short-term funding bills that the government perpetually has to pass to get us just a couple months down the road. Americans know that this is not the way a government is supposed to be run. It would be nice if we would enter a new chapter of governance where we spend responsibly and budget accordingly.
Quin, what are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that the Democrats have bitten off way more than they could chew, that they can chew, and way more than they should chew. This package of two bills, especially the so-called $3.5 trillion social spending bill, which is actually more like $5.5 trillion when you take away all the budget gimmicks, is a fiscal obscenity. Senator Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia, called it fiscal insanity, and I go further than that. It is fiscal obscenity. The amount of money that this represents is so unbelievably unsustainable that it boggles the mind, especially when we have right now a national debt that it is at 125% of the annual economic output of the United States. That's the highest level in U.S. history, even higher than World War II. It is unsustainable even at current levels, and to add $5.5 trillion on top of that, plus the infrastructure bill, which is another $1 trillion plus, just absolutely cannot be done. And it is totally irresponsible even to be pushing it.
And to Quin's point, Janet Yellen at the Treasury just mentioned the other week that we're going to run out of cash in the bank by October 18th as a country. And it's not for no reason. It's because we just have no grasp of how to tax and spend responsibly in this country. I came of age during the Tea Party movement, and I guess I really did believe in the idea of trying to smother the government in its sleep and make them actually figure out how to live on a budget. And they just never do it. I kind of take issue with the idea that we should be relieved at all. The government's going to have to figure this out at some point, and Democrats and Republicans, the only thing they know how to do is spend.
Erin, what do you think?
Well, I think it's really important to note that spending exploded and the debt exploded under Trump and under Republican control. And so the fact of the matter is that it seems like every time that we have a Democrat in the White House and Democrats hold power in Congress, there's a fear-mongering conversation about the debt and the deficit that doesn't exist, when in fact it's Republican administrations that tend to spend much more. And so I agree with Janet Yellen in the sense that she also said that she thought it would be a good idea to take the power away from Congress to raise the debt ceiling, that this isn't something that should be held politically hostage like this. We've got to back up the full faith and credit of the United States. This is really important to people's bottom lines in this country. And so I agree with her on that point.
So, Stephen, how do you think that we should have approached this after we've hit such high debt ceilings under Trump?
I support pursuing shutdowns until we have balanced budget amendments in place, period.
Quinn, how about you?
Look, I used to work on the House Appropriations Committee back when we were actually holding spending in check, and back when we led to 4 straight years of balanced budgets. It is doable. Bill Clinton was no way out conservative, but under Bill Clinton, and with the Republican Congress holding his heels to the fire, we had a level of spending that was sustainable, that was enough to cover American needs. Since then, for 20 years, under 4 different administrations now, we have the budget has gone up on average twice the inflation rate for 2 consecutive decades, Republican and Democrat alike. And some of us, yes, Erin, criticized George Bush for it, criticized Obama for it, criticized Trump for it. And so we do have standing to criticize Biden for it too, because Biden now is adding far more than any of them did before, except for the various COVID relief packages. Again, it is utterly unsustainable and will cause a financial crisis in the country, the likes of which we have never seen.
And Quinn, the thing that sets him apart from all those other presidents is he's the first one to actually say that it costs zero to do any of this. And that's just kind of how the Overton window has shifted here, is now we're not even talking about whether or not we should spend. We're just having this gaslight situation where we're not even being told that we're actually spending. It's pretty egregious.
Well, let's hope we come to some good resolution. Also this week, Pentagon brass went before Congress to explain the exit from Afghanistan. Here's CBS News coverage.
5.5 hours of testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee left no doubt top generals warned both Presidents Trump and Biden against a withdrawal of American troops. General Frank McKenzie is the overall commander for Afghanistan.
I recommended that we maintain 2,500 troops in Afghanistan.
But when asked last month whether his military advisors recommended keeping 2,500 troops there, President Biden said this.
No one said that to me that I can recall.
General Milley, that was a false statement by the President of the United States, was it not?
I'm not going to categorize a statement of a President of the United States.
General Milley, I can only conclude
that your advice about staying in Afghanistan was rejected. Why haven't you resigned?
It would be an incredible act of political defiance for a commissioned officer to just resign because my advice is not taken. This country doesn't want generals figuring out what orders we are going to accept and do or not.
But books about the final days of the Trump administration portray Milley as doing just that, working behind his commander-in-chief's back because he feared Trump might provoke an international crisis.
Okay, Mr. Hillyer, this question is for you. Did the generals make a good case at the hearing?
They made a terrible case, although they did at least confirm what had been reported, that Joe Biden lied when he said he had not been advised by military leaders to keep some troops in Afghanistan. Several of the top generals said that they so advised him, and it was a flat-out lie when Biden said otherwise. But the generals did not acquit themselves very well either. They did not have any good excuses for how they botched this so incredibly badly. They did not explain why we gave up Bagram Air Base, or at least not satisfactorily, why we gave up the air base before we had gotten our people out of there. I could go on, but basically the whole thing was the single worst American performance, the single worst American embarrassment on the international stage, including the exit from Vietnam, the single worst in our lifetime and maybe in the history of the country.
Erin, what's your response?
Well, I would say the single biggest embarrassment in our lifetimes is absolutely what happened on January 6th, when there was an attempt to overthrow the government and not recognize the legitimate outcome of an election, and the fact that folks are still going along with that. But with regards to Afghanistan, it's been a really upsetting and disappointing to see what happened with the exit. The fact of the matter is that Afghanistan and the activities that the United States government was engaged in under a variety of presidents was not going to work. And there did have to be a pullout at some point. I agree with the decision to pull out. I think the manner in which it happened was chaotic and shameful and dangerous. And I also think it's really important to note that while I do not have applause for the Biden administration on how this was handled, I want to be clear about that. At the same time, I think it's really important to note that under the Trump administration, an incredibly foolish decision was made to directly provide a pullout date to the Taliban that was tied to a date rather than conditions for withdrawal. That was stupid foreign policy, and that also was led up to this horrific exit that we saw.
Stephen, what do you think could have been a better approach?
I don't believe there was a better approach, and I will part with our panelists here from the left and the right and say that there is no such thing as an orderly and dignified withdrawal from the country of Afghanistan. It is the single greatest foreign policy lie that the Pentagon has gotten us addicted to ever since Vietnam, that we can control the state of affairs in certain countries across the world where we have no sense of how the things work on the ground, the different cultures of the people of which we're trying to govern. It doesn't work. This was the only way it was ever going to happen. And I applaud Joe Biden for standing up for himself when he is being berated by generals and everyone in the Pentagon telling him to maintain the status quo. The same thing that they did to Barack Obama when Joe Biden in that administration found himself trying to convince Barack Obama to not listen to the likes of Milley and keeping more troops and funneling more soldiers into Afghanistan. And in this case, Milley was trying to argue that he needed to put more troops into Afghanistan past the deadline, which was going to then trigger a military confrontation with the Taliban. You know what happens when you get a military confrontation with the Taliban? The Pentagon gets another blank check to stay 5 to 10 more years. And it had to stop. And this was the only way it was going to, on deadline, on time. And if that makes us look bad, can't look any worse than the past 20 years has.
Quinn, do you see any upside to this?
No, there's no upside to this, and I disagree with just about every word Stephen just said from top to bottom. And I don't have time to go through them all, except to say that the last assertion that he made that there was no better way to do this is utterly absurd, even if you agree, which I don't, that we had to pull out and that we had to pull out when we did. But you could do it in a more orderly fashion. You could keep Bagram Air Force Base until the very end. You could not give a date certain that the Taliban would know about. You do not leave Bagram Air Base without even telling the Afghani army that you're going to do so, and you don't do it in the middle of the night. You make darn sure that all of your American citizens there know that they absolutely must get to one of the air bases, either the airport or the air base, before you pull out. There's all sorts of things that could have been done better. And then, at the very least, you don't lie to the American public by telling them that you did not get advice from generals to keep 2,500 troops in there when you absolutely did.
Erin, what's your final word on this?
Well, I agree with much of what Quinn just said. And I do think, to go back to what happened, it's horrifying. Who does not have the images seared in their mind of Afghans trying to cling onto airplanes as they're leaving the air base? This was a horrific exit. This should not have happened the way it did. And it's so, so sad. And my heart is particularly with the activists and the women of Afghanistan who are continuing to do work bravely on the ground, but who the U.S. government turned their backs on after claiming that this war was in part to help protect women's rights, pulling away and not providing the assistance that was needed.
All right. Well, and finally this week, YouTube has made news by taking action against vaccine misinformation. Here again is CNBC to explain.
So the new guidelines mean you cannot post videos that have harmful misinformation about vaccine safety. And here are some of the examples they are talking about: that approved vaccines cause autism, that they cause infertility, or have microchips so you can be tracked. They will allow videos that debate the scientific process, vaccine policies, and personal testimonials related to vaccines, as long as the channel does not show a pattern of promoting vaccine hesitancy.
So, Stephen Kent, is YouTube making a difference with this move?
Who that spends their time on YouTube, who is already skeptical of vaccines and everything that goes into them and being forced to receive them, is going to change their mind because YouTube stepped in to restrict information flow across their website and for them to be able to search out videos that they might want to watch. The way that people think who are vaccine hesitant and unlikely to get this shot is exactly inflamed by when people step in to try to censor the things that they believe in. They already believe that everything is sort of a conspiracy, right? You cannot make this situation better by censoring content and trying to correct wrongthink when it comes to vaccines.
Erin, do you think this is a free speech issue?
I think this is about disinformation, and this is a modern day equivalent of shouting fire in a theater and the panic that it creates. What happens is that public health disinformation is one of the most important issues and urgent issues of our time right now. And the fact of the matter is that these vaccines have been proven to be safe. They have been proven to be effective. And there is a limited number. In fact, much of the sharing that is happening online is from a limited number of actors who are putting out this disinformation, in many cases being aided and abetted by enemies of the United States, such as Russia, that really want to see our country go down, right? And sharing this information that then gets out there and contributes to horrific outcomes. I mean, the fact of the matter is people in this country know that COVID is striking people close to them. I recently had a very close friend's brother die who'd been vaccinated, who'd had COVID in the first wave, and he died very suddenly. And so the fact of the matter is, and my child just went back to school after a year and a half of learning loss. And so I think it's time to start caring more for one another. YouTube is a business. They absolutely have a right to demand certain standards of information. And I applaud this move wholeheartedly.
Quinn, do you think this is setting an important precedent?
Look, I am 100% pro-vaccine. And I am 100% behind YouTube's legal right to do what they did. Whether it was wise or even appropriate is a completely different question. And I tend to agree with Stephen on that. It gets very dicey when you are basically a forum for a free flow of information when you decide that you are then going to restrict the free flow of information. And sometimes you're wrong. I hearken back to last fall when all of the social media outlets absolutely put the kibosh on the story of Hunter Biden's laptop. They said it was Russian disinformation, and they would not even allow anything to be put on their platforms mentioning it. And they were wrong. There was not a shred of evidence that it was Russian disinformation. The laptops were real. They have been confirmed to be real. And what they did was they censored very relevant information. YouTube is on very dangerous ground in doing it morally, whether or not they have the legal right to do so, and whether or not, in this case, they are right about vaccines, which in this case, they are.
Right. And a lot of this that we're talking about here, like I mentioned, that, there is a principle of speech that is being suppressed, but it's not about whether or not they have the right to do it. Of course, they have the right to do it. It's not going to go to a court, and they're not going to slap that down. And they also have the right, just as a company, to control what kind of content that is on their platform. This is about cause and effect. 70% of Americans at this point have received the jab. And the only people who are at the most risk, 99% of people now, who are at the most risk of getting a fatal case or ending up in the hospital of the coronavirus are people who are unvaccinated. This is the highest risk to those people. We do not need to make these kinds of breaches in public spaces to drag along a reluctant 20 to 30% of the country who are mostly just at a risk to themselves.
Erin, I see you shaking your head down there. Did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, this is just active, purposeful disinformation meant to cause harm. And that actually does demonstrably cause.
I'm causing disinformation?
No. I'm talking about these videos on YouTube. They're absolutely correct to remove them. It's disinformation. It's meant to cause harm. It's causing a public health disaster. I think access to quality information and we're in a fight for truth right now. In a way, we're going through our own enlightenment right now in 2021. What is reason and what is fact? And we're in a new world right now with social media. And so this is something that the platforms are still figuring out. But this particular move by YouTube was a very strong one.
All right. Well, now it's time to take some questions from our viewers. Jody Thompson, thanks for writing in. Do you think having a small force in Afghanistan would have been able to keep the Taliban from taking control?
I think the number, like the small ideas is, of course, it could be anything like to small. A politician might think like 2,500, but small to a general like Milley might be 10,000. So I'm just going to respond with, we could keep them out of anywhere that we want to. We have the most powerful military in the world. The question is whether or not we should be using them and what the goal is. Keeping the Taliban out of a certain city past a certain date, you have to wonder, like, what is the end goal here and what are we trying to achieve? So we can always beat the Taliban. The question is whether or not we should be playing house in the desert with these guys when we need to be getting ready to confront major players on the world stage, such as China, because that day is coming.
I'll tell you what good it was doing. First of all, the Afghanistan study group, a bipartisan group, very respected. What?
Bipartisan means pro-war. Go on.
A bipartisan group, very respected, recommended in February that we keep at least 5,000 troops because they absolutely said, if we pull out, then it is likely that the Taliban will quickly retake the country. They said it is likely that if the Taliban retakes the country, that Al-Qaeda and others will again get a base to operate. And they said, and this is the key thing, that it makes it likely, not just possible, but likely that within 18 to 36 months, they will be able to use it as a staging ground for attacks on the U.S. homeland again. That is why we were there, to stop the terrorist attacks. And number two, the Bagram Air Base was doing us lots of good, not just against the Taliban, but for forward deployment efforts and intelligence efforts that gave us capabilities against, yes, the bigger players that Stephen
and we
mentioned.
Should stay
like
there
China
forever.
and Russia.
And why don't you just say what you believe, which is that we should turn the place into a colony and never leave?
That's not what I said.
Everything that you're arguing is essentially that we should just simply be there, because
absolutely we should be
bad
there.
Things that happen.
There's a difference between being there and turning it into a colony. We have been in Korea for the last 70 years, and nobody says we should get out of there.
Erin,
we're not being actively shot at in Korea.
Yeah, I just really object to the idea that bipartisan it automatically equates to pro-war. I think one can be pro-humanitarian. The fact of the matter is that two things can be true at once. The mission in Afghanistan was not a sustainable one, and there was a reason why people wanted to get out. At the same time, the exit that happened recently was atrocious, and it should have been handled better.
All right, well, now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. Who would like to go first? All right, well, I'm going to call on Stephen.
I completely forgot about this segment, and I am not sure at all which underreported story I want to bring to the table. So I'm going to hit it over to Erin.
Okay.
Oh, sure thing. So on the lighter side, actually not on the lighter side, odd entree, but I was really interested to see a piece in the New York Times this week, a study that's just come out that shows that losing weight is actually less important for health than being physically fit itself. And it really, in particular, under people who are classified as overweight. And I think when you look at the sizeism that exists in our society, that's a really important point, that it's about fitness and not about weight.
All right, Quinn?
I'm supposed to be the conservative on this panel, so you may be surprised that I am saying the most underreported story of the week, even though it did get plenty of space in the New York Times and Washington Post, is the new book by former Trump press secretary Stephanie Grisham, which, along with so many other books by former Trump people, confirm again just how god-awful Donald Trump was in multiple ways, in multiple inexcusable ways. And with all of the other stuff going on in Washington, some of the details have not made it out into general consciousness, including that Trump deliberately talked tougher before the cameras about Russia and Vladimir Putin than he did as soon as the cameras were off. And again, this plays into the very true accusation that Trump had a very weird thing for dictators in general and for Putin in particular, and that he sucked up to Putin again and again and again. This is the sort of stuff that somehow needs to get through to public consciousness so people can understand just what a menace Donald Trump was as president.
Quinn, you're giving me life tonight. I mean, I have been reading those book reviews. And first off, if we want a book club, Stephanie Grisham's book on a future show, I'm all in. But I think it's really refreshing to hear you say that. And I'm relieved, because I will say that one of my top concerns and things that keeps me up at night is the concern about how close our country has come into authoritarianism, and particularly what Trump offered. And I think it's going to take people working together on all sides of the political spectrum to be clear about what happened, and to ensure that that doesn't continue to happen. And in particular, the links with authoritarians worldwide and what happened. So really appreciate you lifting that up. Thank you.
That's all we have time for. I'm Heather Godwin, and you're listening to The Square Circle, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.